Betty White made us laugh for more than 7 decades. She was warm, wise, and always ready with a one-liner. But toward the end of her life, there was one thing she finally admitted, and it left her closest friends in silence. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret feud. It was a single scene on The Golden Girls. A moment so raw, so personal, that Betty could never bring herself to watch it again. Fans thought she was acting, but Betty knew better, because in that scene something broke. And when she finally told the truth about why, it revealed a pain she'd carried quietly for years. A pain that never really went away. When casting first began for The Golden Girls, Betty White wasn't meant to play Rose Nyland. In fact, producers originally wanted her to play Blanche, the saucy Southern flirt, because of her earlier role as Man-Hungry Sue and Nivens on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. And Rue McClanahan was tapped to play the sweet, simple-minded Rose. But the idea didn't sit right. The creators worried about typecasting. Audiences already knew Betty could nail the seductive, razor-sharp one-liner. And Rue was already known for playing timid and innocent. Felt too familiar. So they made a bold switch. Betty would play Rose, and Rue would become Blanche. And just like that, television history shifted. What no one could have predicted at the time, though, was just how much this switch would mean to Betty personally. Because underneath the comedic timing and the adorable St. Olaf stories, there was something else brewing, something the public didn't see. You see, The Golden Girls came into Betty's life just a few short years after she lost the love of her life, her husband Alan Ludden. They had been married for nearly 2 decades when he died of stomach cancer in 1981. And after his death, Betty was never quite the same. She smiled, she worked, she made jokes, but the sparkle in her eye had dimmed. Rose gave her something no one else could in that moment. A way to grieve, without saying she was grieving. The sweet Minnesota widow with a kind heart and gentle voice wasn't just a character. She was an extension of Betty's real self, her vulnerability, her uncertainty, her need for connection. And audiences felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. There was a softness to Betty's performance as Rose that couldn't be taught. A kind of quiet honesty that slipped through the punchlines. It was the kind of performance that didn't scream for attention, but stayed with you long after the episode ended. What Betty brought to Rose wasn't just humor. It was heartache wrapped in kindness. A woman who had lost deeply, but chose to keep loving anyway. Friends later said that taking on the role of Rose helped Betty begin to heal. That each time she stepped into that gentle character, she allowed a little more of her own sadness to soften. And it showed. In the way she listened in scenes. In the way she hesitated just slightly before delivering certain lines. In the way her eyes would well up, not from performance but from something real. Rose became the role Betty was most loved for. But more importantly, it was the role that loved her back. And that's why what happened in season 5 hit so deeply. Because up until then, Betty had been able to keep her emotions safely tucked beneath the surface, giving fans laughter, warmth, and comfort. But that one scene cracked something open. And for the first time in her long career, Betty couldn't hide behind the character anymore. It happened in season 5, episode 7. A quiet installment titled, Rose Fights Back. The plot seemed simple at first. Rose loses her job. She's forced to navigate a world where age, experience, and loyalty no longer guarantee security. She looks for work. She gets turned down. She tries to keep smiling, until she can't anymore. And then comes the moment. Rose, usually so sunny, so patient, so forgiving, breaks. She stands in the living room, her voice trembling, and says something fans never forgot. I worked for them for 22 years. I was more than just punctual. I was never late. I was loyal. I never took sick days. I was employee of the month 6 times. 6 times in 22 years. And they let me go. There's a pause. She's holding back tears. Then she lowers her voice and says the quiet part. I gave them everything I had. And they let me go. On the surface, it was Rose talking. But to anyone who knew Betty, it felt different. Because this wasn't just a scene about losing a job. It was about being discarded. About feeling invisible. about giving your best years to something and realizing the world had moved on without you. And for Betty White, who had already lived through the loss of her husband, who had faced declining roles in an industry that favors youth, who had questioned whether she still had a place on television before Golden Girls gave her one. It was personal. Very personal. Crew members on set that day later said the mood shifted when Betty delivered that monologue. The laughter stopped. The room went still. And for a moment, everyone forgot they were filming a sitcom. Because Betty wasn't acting anymore. She never stumbled, never flubbed a line. But there was a tremble in her voice that no one had heard before. A look in her eyes that wasn't rose. It was Betty, the real Betty, the woman behind the warmth, the widow behind the smile. After the take, there wasn't applause, just silence. Some say she walked off the set quietly, without a word. Others say she stayed in character for a few minutes longer, as if she couldn't shake what just happened. What's clear is that something changed that day. Decades later, one of her longtime friends would recall that Betty never rewatched that episode. She wouldn't bring it up when talking about her favorite scenes. She wouldn't laugh about it the way she did with other Rose moments. She carried it, because that monologue wasn't just a script. It was a wound, the kind of pain you bury so deep, it only rises when you least expect it. Betty had always taken pride in her ability to bring joy to others, to keep the focus on the positive. But in that moment, on that stage, under those lights, she didn't just deliver a line. She delivered a truth that had been sitting quietly inside her for years, and one that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. To the world, Betty White was invincible, quick-witted, always charming, the kind of woman who could steal a scene with a single glance. But off camera, especially in the early years of the Golden Girls, Betty was quietly navigating a world that no longer looked the same. She had lost her husband, Alan Ludden, just a few years before joining the cast. He was the great love of her life, a man she adored deeply. His death didn't just leave her heartbroken, it left her unanchored. And though she smiled for the cameras, Betty was grieving. Not just grieving Alan, but the life they had built together. The shared routines, the quiet moments, the feeling of being part of a pair. Suddenly, she was alone in a way that went deeper than most people realized. And to make things harder, she was now an older woman in Hollywood. An industry that has never been kind to aging women, especially those without a conventional family, or the kinds of box office roles that keep you relevant. By the early 1980s, Betty had already been told more than once that her time had passed, that her best years were behind her. There were fewer roles, fewer offers, and even fewer calls. She was respected, but seen as a relic. And that hurt. She'd spent decades building her career, pioneering female-led television, producing her own shows, breaking into male-dominated spaces. And yet the minute she began to show her age, the doors started to close. So when the Golden Girls came along, Betty saw it as more than just another gig. It was a second chance, a role that gave her dignity, relevance, and most of all, a reason to get up in the morning. But that didn't mean the pain disappeared. Behind the jokes, the award shows, and the glowing press appearances, Betty still struggled with questions that haunted her. Am I still needed? Am I still loved? Am I still seen? And that's exactly what made the Rose Fights Back scene so unbearable. Because it didn't just reflect her character's fears, it mirrored her own. The feeling of being discarded, of aging out of a system that once celebrated you, of having given everything you had, only to wonder if it was ever enough. Friends close to Betty say she never spoke about that monologue directly, but they didn't need her to. They saw it in her eyes when it aired. They saw how she flinched when someone brought it up. They saw the heaviness it carried. And perhaps most revealing of all, they saw how she never watched that episode again. It wasn't a performance she was proud of, though it was one of her best. It was a moment too close to her own truth. And that's something Betty rarely let the world see. She was, by nature, a private person. Someone who believed in joy, gratitude, and good humor. She didn't want sympathy. She didn't need to be seen as fragile. But even the strongest women have moments that break through the armor. And for Betty White, That moment came under bright studio lights, wrapped in the laughter of a sitcom, when the truth she'd been carrying quietly for years finally found its way to the surface. For decades, Betty White was a master at steering the conversation. She could take a tough question and deflect it with a joke. She could turn sorrow into sweetness. And when something hurt too deeply to discuss, she simply didn't. That's how she handled Rose Fights Back. Despite its emotional power, despite fans constantly bringing it up as one of her most moving performances, Betty never talked about it. She never told stories about filming it. She didn't include it in highlight reels or reflect on it during interviews. And when fans asked about her favorite scenes, that one never made the list. At the time, most people assumed she just preferred the lighter episodes. But those closest to her began to understand there was more to it than that. One friend, who spent time with Betty during her later years, recalled that she would gently change the subject if anyone brought up that episode. Not with discomfort, not with bitterness, just a soft pivot, like she was protecting something. And in a way, she was. Betty had built her career on joy, on making people feel good. She believed in kindness, in lightness, in gratitude. Even when she was hurting, especially when she was hurting, she often said, "You don't have to be crude to be funny." And she lived that philosophy. She chose warmth over scandal, grace over gossip. And when it came to her own pain, she believed in keeping it private. But in her final years, something shifted. As she approached her 99th birthday, Betty grew a little more reflective, a little more open about the emotional costs of a life in the spotlight. According to those closest to her, she spoke, quietly and only with a few trusted friends, about the moment that still lingered. That scene, that monologue, that version of Rose that wasn't just a character. She never called it traumatic. She never made it dramatic. But what she said stuck with them. She told one friend, in a moment of quiet honesty, "That one still hurts. It always will." There was no need to explain what she meant, because everyone who knew her knew. It wasn't just about acting. It wasn't even about Rose. It was about a lifetime of giving. Giving to a husband she adored, to an industry that almost left her behind, to fans who expected her to always smile, and suddenly being reminded that none of it protected her from feeling forgotten. That scene stripped away all the laughter and left behind something raw. It showed the part of Betty White that was still grieving, still scared, still human. And for a woman who built her entire legacy on making others feel safe and loved, admitting that she had quietly carried that pain for so long was, in itself, an act of courage. She didn't need to turn it into a headline. She didn't want sympathy. But in that small admission, in that quiet moment of truth, Betty gave us something even greater than laughter. She gave us honesty, the kind that says, yes, even someone like her still hurts sometimes. In the years since The Golden Girls first aired, fans have returned to their favorite episodes again and again. There's comfort in them: Dorothy's sarcasm, Blanche's fire, Sophia's bite, and Rose's pure heart. But among the laughter and unforgettable one-liners, there's one scene that quietly rises to the top every time. Rose Fights Back. Long before Betty White's passing, the scene had already carved out a place in television history. But after she was gone, it hit harder, felt different, like a final message she left behind, not as a performer but as a person. Clips of the monologue resurfaced across social media. Fans old and new watched it with fresh eyes. And something happened. People started seeing the pain. Not Rose's pain, Betty's. Thousands of comments poured in from older viewers who said they finally felt seen. That someone had captured what it felt like to grow older in a world that moves faster every year. They said it reminded them of the jobs they gave their lives to, only to be let go. The families they supported, only to feel forgotten. The friends they lost along the way. The fear of being invisible after a lifetime of showing up. Younger viewers, some watching The Golden Girls for the first time, were stunned by the emotional depth. Many admitted they had never thought about aging like that before. Some even said it made them want to call their mothers or grandmothers and just listen. And that's the quiet power of Betty White. She never screamed to be heard. She never demanded attention. But in that one moment, without meaning to, she said what millions of people had been feeling all along. That growing older isn't just about wrinkles or birthdays. It's about being remembered. It's about wondering if you still matter. And somehow, through Rose, she gave that fear a voice. In the final years of her life, Betty continued to be a symbol of joy and resilience. She was celebrated, adored, and honored as the legend she was. But that scene, the one she never spoke about, never wanted to rewatch, remains one of her most unforgettable gifts. Because it showed us the woman behind the smile. It reminded us that even our brightest stars carry shadows. And it taught us that strength isn't about pretending you don't hurt. Sometimes, strength is about carrying that hurt and choosing to keep loving anyway. Betty never needed a dramatic send-off. She didn't chase controversy. She didn't reveal tabloid secrets. She gave us something far more powerful. A single moment. A scene that still lingers. And the quiet truth that even now, years later, still hurts. Betty White never needed to shout to be heard. She lived a life full of laughter, light, and love. But behind the scenes, she also carried moments of quiet pain. She didn't talk about them often. That wasn't her way. But in one unforgettable scene on The Golden Girls, she let it show. And whether she meant to or not, that moment became one of the most honest human things she ever gave us. It reminded us that aging isn't easy, that loss lingers, and that even the strongest hearts can still ache. Betty didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to relive that pain out loud. She gave us the truth in a look, in a trembling voice, in a line that still echoes today. And in doing so, she gave us more than comedy. She gave us connection, because behind all the laughs, it still hurts. For more emotional stories, check out this video.